Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a pretty deep legal analysis today,
Yeah.
looking at a specific and frankly quite severe criminal offense, mayhem.
Right.
Our mission today is really to figure out what happens when a devastating injury occurs, but it's to a body part that isn't specifically spelled out in the law.
Mm-hmm.
We're zooming in on how courts interpret this one tiny kind of vague phrase in the statute, other bodily member.
Yeah, that phrase does a lot of work.
It really does. And this distinction, I mean, it can literally bump a severe battery charge up to a Class C felony. That's serious stuff.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating here, I think, is that the definition of a bodily member, well, it's not static, It's evolved quite dramatically from the statute's common law roots.
Right.
So we need to trace that history. We'll look at the original idea, protecting a subject's ability to fight for the king, and see how it shifted to its modern rationale. And our analytical path, it's going to lead us through a really important case, State v. Quintana. We'll use that to model a rigorous element-by-element analysis, really dig into how the court applied and, crucially, expanded this key term.
Yeah, that's the tension right there, isn't it? If the victim suffers a severe disabling injury, say, to the forehead, which obviously protects the brain, does that area, not being a traditional limb or eye, still count as mayhem?
That's the core question.
Okay, let's start with the basics then, the black letter law. What is the definition of mayhem under Wisconsin statute section 940.21, and what are the specific elements the state has to prove?
Okay, so the general rule defines mayhem like this. Whoever, with intent to disable or disfigures or mutilates the tongue, eye, ear, nose, lip, limb, or other bodily member of another is guilty of a Class C felony.
Right.
So the state needs to successfully prove three core elements to get a conviction.
Three things. Oh, yeah.
First, the defendant has to possess the specific intent to disable or disfigure. That's a really critical mental state distinction we need to keep in mind.
Specific intent.
Got it.
Second, the act itself must involve cutting or mutilating one of those named body parts, tongue, eye, etc., or an other bodily member. That's our key phrase again.
Yeah.
And third, that cutting or mutilating has to produce great bodily harm.
Great bodily harm. Okay, specific intent, cutting, mutilating a listed part or other bodily member, and great bodily harm. Before we apply those, let's get that historical context you mentioned. Why does this statute even need interpretation? It sounds old. How did the history, from English common law, the Coventry Act, how did that shape this term bodily member?
Well, the history is absolutely key to understanding why the modern statute is interpreted so broadly. You see, back at English common law, mayhem was very narrowly focused. It was strictly about violence that made someone less able in fighting, either to defend himself or annoy his adversary.
Less able in fighting. So basically, did it affect their ability to be a soldier? Exactly. It was all about military utility. Could the king still use this person in battle? So if you, say, cut off someone's finger, well, that was mayhem because it impaired their fighting ability.
Right. Hard to hold a sword.
Precisely. But this also meant that pure disfigurement, like, say, severely injuring someone's nose or ear, that generally was not mayhem back then because, it didn't necessarily impact their ability to fight.
Huh. So just making someone look different wasn't enough.
Not under the original common law definition, and that glaring gap, really, led directly to the Coventry Act in 1670.
The Coventry Act. That's the famous one, isn't it? Where Sir John Coventry's nose was slit in an ambush after he made some remarks in Parliament.
That's the one. It was a really shocking act of malicious disfigurement. But under that old common law standard, it technically didn't qualify as mayhem.
Because it didn't affect his fighting ability.
Right. So Parliament stepped in. The Coventry Act expanded the crime to explicitly include injuries like slitting the nose. It was a huge step. It started defining mayhem based more on the severity and, importantly, the malice of the intent, moving away from just pure military function.
So the Coventry Act basically said, look, malicious disfigurement is just as serious as making someone unable to fight. And that leads us straight to the modern policy rationale.
It really does. The modern rationale, as courts like in Clausen have cited, is about the preservation of the natural completeness and normal appearance of the human face and body. The law has completely shifted. It's moved away from the sovereign's military needs, focusing instead on protecting the individual's physical integrity, their wholeness. And that this policy shift is critical because it really requires a broad reading of that phrase, other bodily member.
Understood. So the old law protected the ability to fight. The modern law protects, well, the body's natural completeness and appearance. Okay, let's use that lens now. Let's analyze State v. Quintana. This case sounds like it really forced the courts to draw a clear line here. Let's analyze State v. Quintana. First, what are the legally dispositive facts?
Okay, the facts are pretty grim. In September 2004, Leonard Quintana allegedly went into the bedroom of his ex-wife, Shannon, while she was asleep. He then struck her multiple times with a hammer.
Horrific.
Yes. The attack was described as savage. Shannon suffered 3 blows to the head. The injuries were incredibly severe. One blow fractured her skull and her forehead. It tore the protective lining of her brain, the dura mater, and it caused spinal fluid leakage.
Wow.
Yeah, she ended up with what was described as significant intracranial injury. Air inside the brain, blood inside the brain. Doctors said there was a serious potential for death, and the long-term consequences, sadly, included lifelong post-traumatic headaches and memory deficits.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
Okay, so given those facts, what was the core legal issue the court had to grapple with?
The precise legal question was this. Does the forehead, which was obviously severely fractured and injured in this attack, qualify as an other bodily member under Wisconsin's mayhem statute? That was the whole ballgame for the mayhem charge.
Right. Okay, what rule of law did the court apply then? Can you state the full black-letter rule again and break down its testable elements as the court used them?
Sure. The court applied the standard rule for mayhem. It requires proof that the defendant acted, 1, with the specific intent to disable or disfigure, 2, that the act was done by cutting or mutilating a listed part or an other bodily member, and 3, that the action produced great bodily harm.
Thank you. Okay, now for the court's elemental analysis. Let's walk through this step by step. Now, the defense must have argued strongly that the forehead isn't a limb or a lip or any of the listed parts. So how did the court tackle the second element, the definitional one? Does the forehead qualify as an other bodily member?
Right, that was the crux. The court started by acknowledging, yes, the listed parts, tongue, eye, ear, nose, lip, limb, they're specific. But importantly, the legislature deliberately added the phrase, other bodily member.
Intentionally broader language.
Exactly. The court saw that as signaling legislative intent for broader protection, not just limited to those specific parts. And then the court really zeroed in on avoiding what it called an absurd result.
An absurd result? What do they mean by that? What was the court's specific reasoning for calling the exclusion of the forehead absurd?
Well, their logic went something like this. The statute clearly says that disabling or disfiguring a nose or an ear parts arguably less essential for, basic survival is mayhem. So the court reasoned it would be completely illogical, really absurd, if disabling the forehead, a structure that protects the brain, the body's most vital organ, did not qualify as mayhem.
That makes sense. If harming the nose is mayhem, harming the thing that protects the brain certainly should be.
Precisely. They concluded that the whole purpose of the statute, which we discussed protecting the completeness and integrity of the body, would be fundamentally undermined if other bodily member was interpreted so narrowly as to exclude parts of the head, like the forehead or the skull. Therefore, the court concluded the forehead must be included under other bodily member.
Okay, so the history, the policy, the need to avoid absurdity, it all points toward including the forehead.
All right.
But that brings us right back to the defense's, I think, strongest counter-argument. Quintana argued, okay, if you broaden member to include skin and bone of the head, aren't you basically just making mayhem the same thing as aggravated battery, except, with a much harsher penalty? How did the court deal with that? How did they connect it back to the first element, that specific intent piece?
Yes. And that is the absolute linchpin of the whole decision. The court directly addressed this and clarified that mayhem is distinguishable. And it's distinguishable precisely because of that first element, the requirement of specific intent. Aggravated battery, you see, often only requires general intent, basically, the intent to commit the violent act itself. Mayhem, on the other hand, requires the specific, deliberate goal to disable or disfigure the victim. It's a different, more malicious state of mind.
Right. But how did the court actually determine that Quintana, in the act of striking Shannon with a hammer, had that specific intent to disfigure or disable?
Yeah.
I mean, proving that exact state of mind during such a violent, chaotic attack seems incredibly difficult. How do you get inside his head?
It is difficult, absolutely. And the court acknowledged that specific intent often has to be inferred from the defendant's conduct and the surrounding circumstances. You can't just ask them, right?
Right.
So in Quintana, the court looked at things like the severity and the manner of the assault. You have repeated blows to the head of a sleeping person with a hammer.
Yeah, the circumstances are damning.
Extremely. The court inferred that using a weapon like that, directing it repeatedly at such a vulnerable, exposed part of the body, While that's strong circumstantial evidence, it suggests the defendant intended the natural and probable consequences of those actions, which, in this case, would clearly be severe disabling injury and disfigurement. It's that calculated cruelty, that malice, that elevates the crime beyond just battery.
Okay, so the specific intent is the firewall. That's what keeps mayhem distinct and justifies the Class C felony, even if the physical harm might look somewhat similar to what you'd see in a very severe aggravated battery case.
Exactly. That specific intent element is doing all the work to separate the two crimes.
Understood. So after analyzing the history, the policy, the statutory language, the specific intent, what was the court's final conclusion regarding the application of the mayhem rule to Quintana's actions?
The court held definitively, yes, the forehead does qualify as an other bodily member under the Wisconsin Mayhem statute. Their conclusion rested on that mandate for broad construction, ensuring the phrase covers basically all bodily parts the legislature intended to protect from intentional disfigurement or disabling, and, critically, the finding that Quintana acted with that necessary specific intent.
Wow. That makes the scope of this statute incredibly broad then, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Okay, to really cement this idea, this concept of all bodily parts, let's try a quick, maybe a bit visceral hypothetical. Let's say a defendant intentionally cuts off a person's big toe, and they do it with the specific intent to mess up their balance, to disable their gait. Now, the big toe isn't explicitly listed. It's not a tongue, eye, ear, nose, lip, or even whole limb, technically.
Yeah.
Could the prosecution successfully charge mayhem in that scenario?
Yes, absolutely. Under the Quintana analysis and the broad interpretation it established, that charge would almost certainly stick.
Even for a toe?
Even for a toe. While, yeah, you could argue the toe is part of the limb, the court's reasoning in Quintana was much broader. They concluded other bodily member essentially encompasses all bodily parts if the injury leads to disabling or serious disfigurement, and the intent is there.
Okay.
So, the prosecution would focus on how losing the big toe causes significant functional disablement problems with balance, walking, running, and they'd couple that with evidence proving the defendant had the specific intent to cause that disability. Remember the modern rationale, protecting the completeness of the body. Losing a toe definitely compromises that completeness.
That really drives home how broad other bodily member has become. Okay, this brings up a really important practical point then. How do we synthesize all of this? For you, the listener, if you encounter a situation that might be mayhem, what's the sort of actionable tool, the checklist, you need to run through to analyze it properly?
Right. Let's boil it down into a practical framework. This combines the history, the policy, and specifically the Quintana holding. When you're issue spotting for mayhem, you need to run this 3-step diagnostic checklist.
Okay, step 1.
Step 1 is the intent check. You have to ask, did the defendant act with the specific intent to disable or disfigure? Remember, general intent just to hurt isn't enough for mayhem. If you can't reasonably infer that specific intent from the facts the weapon used, the nature of the attack, the location of the injuries, then it's likely not mayhem, maybe aggravated battery, but not mayhem.
Okay, specific intent first, step 2.
Step 2 is the harm check. Did the action actually produce great bodily harm? This isn't minor stuff. It has to be a severe physical injury. Serious permanent disfigurement, loss or impairment of a bodily member or organ, that kind of thing.
Got it, severe harm. And step 3.
Step 3 is the member check, but interpreted broadly. Was the injury inflicted by cutting or mutilating one of the specifically listed members, tongue, eye, ear, etc., or an other bodily member? And this is where you must apply the Quintana rule. That phrase, other bodily member, is interpreted very broadly now. It includes essentially all bodily parts if injuring that part undermines the statute's underlying purpose, which is protecting the body's natural completeness and appearance, and it results in disablement or disfigurement.
So intent, harm, and member with member, now meaning pretty much any body part, if the intent and harm level are met.
That's the core takeaway for analysis.
So let's recap where we landed. We started with this really old statute, seemingly archaic, with this one vague phrase, other bodily member. And through some rigorous judicial analysis, looking at history, policy, and specific cases like Quintana, we see how the law actually modernizes its reach. It stretches to protect, well, virtually every part of the human body against these intentional, savage, disabling kinds of injuries.
Right. It really takes a crime that was originally based on, military usefulness and transforms it into a crime focused squarely on personal maliciousness and the violation of bodily integrity.
It really highlights that crucial difference, doesn't it, between just causing severe injury, which is terrible, and its battery, and acting with that specific, malicious, almost calculated goal of disfiguring someone or disabling them permanently.
Exactly. That specific intent is the absolute key. It's what defines this crime and justifies its very severe penalty.
Okay, let's end with the final provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on. If the original common law focused solely on fighting capability, sort of the ultimate function of the body back then, and the modern law, we've seen focuses heavily on appearance and completeness, maybe more of an aesthetic function, or at least integrity, are there any conceivable modern injuries, perhaps involving things like, say, cybernetic or bionic augmentations that might actually fall under the original common law definition of mayhem because they impair a function, but might still fall outside the scope of the modern statute's focus on natural completeness? Something for you to mull over as you explore this further.